Hi guys, thanks for watching 3dmotive.com. My name is Mike, and in this video we're going to be creating terrain using the terrain editor in UDK. This video is intended for beginner or intermediate levels and assumes that you are comfortable with the basics of Unreal and Photoshop. In this tutorial I will show you how to use all of the features and tools associated with the terrain editor inside the UDK engine. We will cover all of the major tools, including terrain LODing, deco and foliage layers, setting up terrain materials, and the various painting tools in the terrain editor. All of these tools can be used to create a scene just like this one. So let's go ahead and get started. So in this first part of the video, I'm going to explain to you exactly what terrain is. And terrain is basically and generally used to create landscapes for exterior levels. In some cases, I will use terrain for blockout purposes, unlike this scene. When you first start creating an exterior organic level, it's much easier to block out specific paths and basic composition with terrain than it is with any other method. We can get a little bit more in depth into the technical details of terrain a little bit later on. But first, I'm going to show you how to actually add a terrain actor to your level. So we'll go up here to File, and we'll go to New, and we'll create a new level. Go ahead and select Additive for our geometry style, and press OK. And this will give us a fresh new level to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the camera out a little bit here. Now there's two ways to actually add a terrain actor to your level. The first way, you go to your content browser, actor classes, and down under info, select terrain, and then right click in the world and add terrain here. And the other way is a little bit better in my opinion. If you go to Tools, New Terrain, it'll actually bring up this Terrain Wizard dialog box. And this is great because you can actually set a few parameters before you actually create the terrain. Like for example, here you have your location. So when you actually create your terrain, the pivot of the terrain is going to be set at 0, 0, 0 in the world. And you can also set the number of patches. We'll leave it at 16 by 16 for right now. And go to Next, and the layer setup, it's fine if you just leave it at None, and Finish. And then here is our terrain that's been created at 0, 0, 0 in the world in our level. And you'll notice also it added the default Unreal checkerboard texture to our terrain as well. And we'll go up and select wireframe mode, and you'll notice that our terrain is made up of multiple patches within the terrain. So if you remember before when we were in that Terrain Wizard dialog box, we set the terrain to have 16 by 16 patches. So if you go down and you actually count the number of patches, it's 16 by 16 patches. So we can always edit the number of patches on the terrain by selecting the terrain, pressing F4 to bring up the terrain properties, and then under the terrain pull down, you'll notice that you have a bunch of options for your terrain. And right here under num patches X and num patches Y, you'll notice that it's set to 16, 16. So if you want a larger terrain, you can set the number of patches to something like 256 by 256. And you'll notice that our terrain got much bigger. You do want to be careful when you're actually creating your terrain. There are a lot of options they give you to optimize your terrain to help performance out at runtime. We'll get into some of those details later. There is one other thing that I wanted to show you with controlling the number of patches. If you go up to Display and Draw Scale, you can actually edit these draw scale values to shrink or expand your terrain. So if I come in here and change the X and the Y to 512, you'll notice that our terrain got a lot bigger. And this isn't exactly the size that I want. If I come in here to our content browser and grab just a regular skeleton mesh character, and I'll right click, add actor, and add skeleton mesh, you'll see just how large this terrain is. And for this particular scene, I don't really want this terrain that big, so I'm actually going to come in here and put a lower value like 128 by 128. And what this will do is it'll actually compact the patches so that there's a little bit more tessellation for me to work with when I actually start sculpting the terrain. You'll notice down here the number of patches still stayed at 256, but they're squashed down into a 128 by 128 distance. And for the Z value, I'm going to put something like 16, just so it's a little bit smoother when we go to sculpt. Scale is very important when you're first creating terrain. If you're like me and you like to keep everything on the grid, you'll notice that all the numbers that I have actually punched in for the number of patches in the draw scale are powers of 2. This way we can easily figure out how large our terrain is by using a simple equation. All you really have to do is multiply your number of patches x by your draw scale 3D x to find out the number of units across in x the terrain takes up. So we bring up our calculator and we go 128 multiplied by 256. You'll see that our units across in x is 32,768. If you have a distance already in mind before you're creating terrain, you can easily use this equation to find out how to make the terrain that many units. And you can do the same exact thing for the y values. Now there's one more thing we need to talk about before we actually get to the fun stuff, and that is LODing. It's very important to make sure that your terrain is LODing properly so you get better performance at runtime. So there's a few properties we need to look at when messing with the LODs of terrains. So we're going to pull the camera way out, and you can already see that by default we have some LODing happening on our terrain. And you can see these layers. The further the camera is away from these patches, the larger the patches are going to get. The first properties we're going to look at are the max and min tessellation levels. Now these two properties work together. So by default, the max tessellation level is set to 4 and the min is set to 1. This is going to give you 3 different variants of levels of different size patches. So if we set the min to 2, which is half of the max tessellation level, you'll see we only get 1. Where if I set this to 4, there is no LODing happening whatsoever on our terrain. So it's usually a good idea to leave these alone at 1 and 4. But if you feel like you want to mess around with them to get different results of LODing, then by all means go ahead and play with it. The next thing we're going to look at is down here under tessellation distance scale. So if we bring this camera a little bit closer to our terrain and we start tweaking the value of the tessellation distance scale, you'll see that the patches start getting larger closer to the camera. So the higher the number in tessellation distance scale, the closer the LODing is going to happen to the player. So for this particular scene, I'm going to set it to around 2.5, which is a pretty decent scale value that I don't think you'd really notice when you're running around on the ground. So now that we're done with that, we can go ahead and close our terrain properties for now. And now we're going to get into actually editing our terrain, which is the fun part. So if you go over here to the left-hand side of Unreal, you'll see the Terrain Editing Mode button. If you click that, it'll open up our Unreal Terrain Edit options. And this is essentially the hub of all tools for editing terrain. Now this can be pretty overwhelming at first, the amount of tools that are within the Terrain Edit mode. The first thing we're going to look at are the paintbrushes up here under Tools. And the main one I want to focus on now is the Paint tool. So if we go ahead and select the Paint tool, and by default you should have 0, 0, 0, strength, radius, and fall off set to 0. So if you take your mouse over the terrain, you'll notice that there's a red dot, and this red dot will snap to your specific patches. So what we want to do is we'll go over here to this corner over here, and we'll bring the strength up quite a bit and bring the radius up, and you'll notice this red ring that is now around your red dot. And if you take the fall off up a little bit, you'll notice that there's a secondary red ring around your red circle, which is the fall off of the brush. So we want to make sure we have height map selected, and we'll move this out of the way a little bit. And if you hold down Control and left click anywhere on the terrain, you'll start sculpting terrain up to make some mountains or hills. And if we turn on Unlit mode, you'll see that we're actually sculpting the geometry. And if you wanted to make crevices or valleys or anything like that, you hold down Control and right click and the terrain will start going down. And so then you can start mixing these together, start getting a much more organic and natural look to your terrain. It's always better to work in lit mode so you can actually see what you're doing and not in wireframe mode. So we'll go to lit mode, and you can see we don't have a light added to our scene yet. So I'm just going to go ahead and right click, add actor, and we'll add a dominant directional light to our scene. And we'll need to close out the terrain edit box, and we'll just pull this light up a little bit and angle it so we can actually see some depth going on. And you'll also notice that I did add a basic material to our terrain. It makes it a lot easier to see rather than having that checkerboard. And I'll get more into adding materials to our terrain in a few minutes. So we'll go back to the terrain editing mode. And you'll notice our brush size is based on our radius and fall off. If I bring the radius up quite a bit, you'll notice that our radius is increased on the brush and we can get much broader strokes. So if you have a lot of terrain to cover, it's always good to go big first and then do the smaller details later. And if we take the fall off down completely, you'll notice that our secondary ring has disappeared. And if we paint, it's going to be a much sharper transition with no fall off. So you'll get little cuts in your terrain, which it doesn't exactly turn out to be the best thing. So we'll want to have our fall off up a little bit and just start painting some of these mountains up a little bit. You can see we're already getting a very organic terrain look. And so now that we're done with that, we'll go ahead and show you the next tool here, and this is the smooth brush. So we'll go ahead and click this button right here. It looks like a little hump. And when we go into our terrain and we use control and left click, it's going to start to smooth out our painting that we've done. And you can control the radius and the fall off just like in the painting brush here. You can set the strength down quite a bit as well, and you can just get a little bit of smoothing here and there. And it kind of gets rid of those little grooves we have in here that don't look that great. And so this is good, especially when you're trying to smooth out some things that are too sharp, because terrain, if we go to wireframe, you'll see that, terrain starts getting a little stretched. The further up you go or the further down you go, it'll start stretching. So you can come in here and smooth out those areas a little bit. Then if we come in here and hold down control and right click with the smooth brush, it's basically unsmoothing your terrain. And I would probably recommend not using this too much because it starts getting some really ugly results. You can come in here and control left click and smooth those areas out. And then we can come in here to our noise brush, click on that, give this a little bit more strength. If you come into your terrain, control left click, you'll start actually taking the vertices of the terrain and moving them all around to give a little bit of noise to them. So you can make some pretty rough ground area. And again, with this, I would suggest not using it too much just because it starts getting some pretty nasty results with stretching the vertices up too far. Then we can come back here and grab our smooth brush, and then we can smooth these out a little bit. So you just get a little bit of variation. So you can go back and forth between the noise brush and set the smooth down a little bit. And then we'll start smoothing these out a tiny bit, just so you get a little bit of humps here and there. It just gives your terrain a little bit more variety rather than being all smooth. Next we'll move on to the next tool, which is the average brush. And what the average brush will do is it'll take the first point you select all the way to the last point you select and try and average the vertices from one point to the next. So it's actually pretty good for doing like inclines or ramps that the player would go up. So for the average tool, we'll bring the strength down, the radius and fall off down a little bit. And if I control left click way up here and go all the way down, you can see that it's starting to average the vertices. So you get this sort of like an incline that the player could go up. And then you can come in here and you notice that it didn't do so well on the sides here, so we can just grab the smooth brush again and just start smoothing these out a little bit. So now you have a nice ramp going up that the player will easily be able to get up. The next tool we're going to look at is the flatten brush, which is located right here. Go ahead and click on that, and we'll go over here to the top of the mountain, control left click, and start painting. And what this does is it'll bring all the vertices around where you first click up to that point in space. So you're going to start flattening out areas like a plateau or something like that. This is actually really good too if you want to start, like say you did a mountain and you don't really like how it looks. You can just find a flat area and control left click, and then it'll start kind of erasing back down to where you started. This is really great also for doing blockout walls or cliffs or something like that you can just easily come in and do a player path. And then you can always come in here to the smooth and start smoothing some of this down a little bit, because you're going to get some stretching when you use this tool. So the next tool we're going to look at is called the Paint Vertex tool. And a lot of people tend to skip over this one just because it's a little bit more complex than the regular sculpting brushes. So if we click on the Paint Vertex tool and come to an open space here, control left click, you'll notice it's going to start painting vertices on our terrain. And then if we control right click, you'll notice that it paints them away. And so if we go in here and paint a path of vertices essentially, bring up the strength a little bit, and if you hold Control and Alt and left click up, you'll notice that it's going to start to raise the terrain up. And this can be pretty useful, especially if you're wanting to block out some paths or something like that. It has its uses. And another thing to note with this tool is that there's a soft select checkbox over here under settings, and if you have that clicked on, you'll notice that when you start painting our vertices on here, you'll notice the gray and black dots. So if we come over here and increase the fall off of our brush with soft select on, you'll notice that we get a pretty smooth gradient. And then when we actually go in and Control Alt left click, it's going to start to raise the terrain but have a smooth transition from the black to the white. So it pretty much works like soft select in 3ds Max. It does the same kind of thing. Now there is one thing to note, and that is the Paint Vertex tool is the only tool that can use this soft select checkbox over here. So none of the other painting tools you'll be able to actually use soft select. So that about sums up all the painting tools within the terrain edit window. Now you should have the knowledge to start coming in here and painting realistic looking terrain using the tools that I just showed you. There are a few cool tricks with the painting tools, and that is over here under Per Tool. If you check this on and you actually set certain numbers for your strength, radius, fall off, it'll keep those associated with that tool. So if I come over here to smooth, you'll notice that it kept the last used settings for the smooth tool. And if I come up here to paint, it's going to keep these settings. Whereas if I have this off and I change the strength, you'll notice that when I go to the smooth tool, it keeps the settings of the painting tool that I just set. And there's also some presets down here where if you click on these, there's already made presets for you for sculpting your terrain. If you actually click on your painting tool or any of the other sculpting tools, and you have a setting that you really like that's really working for your specific level, you can actually come down here, right click, and save preset. And now when you come back to this, it'll have your saved preset there. And there's also mirroring right here, where if I mirror on the X and select any one of the sculpting tools, you'll notice that it's actually mirroring on my terrain. So whatever I sculpt here, let's bring the strength up a little bit. Whatever I sculpt here, it's actually showing up on the other side as well. And you can do Y mirroring, which is on the opposite side, or you can do X and Y, which is basically all around. So this is great when you're actually making like multiplayer maps where you have to have a symmetrical map or something like that. You'll be able to set this and create walls that are perfectly symmetrical. So we'll go ahead and turn mirroring off for now. And the next tool that I wanted to show you is called Add or Remove Sectors. And this is a very, very important tool, especially with the size of your terrain. If you remember back when we were talking about the number of patches in our terrain, we turn on wireframe here, we have all the patches we set in our properties. If you go to add and remove sectors, and you control left click, you'll notice it's going to start adding green lines, and if you let go of left click, it's going to start adding those sectors to your terrain. So you can come in here, and if you need your terrain to expand a larger distance, you can come in and add sectors and it will expand your terrain. And if you hold down control and right click, you can actually start removing sectors, and it'll start removing sectors from your terrain. We press F4 and come to our terrain properties. You'll notice that it actually updated our number of patches within the terrain. So this is great for controlling the size of your terrain after you've done a lot of work and you don't want to lose any data. And on that note, we'll move on to these next few tools that are the split tools and the merge tools. And what you can do with your terrain is you can come over here to split, and you'll notice that there's a yellow line here. And you can choose where to split your terrain. Control left click, and it'll bring up a prompt asking you if you want to split the terrain. If you press yes, it will now have split your terrain in two separate terrain actors. So if we come up here to our find actors and we search for terrain, you'll notice that we now have two terrains because we just split it. So this is good for streaming, or even if you wanted to split the terrain and then delete this terrain actor to cut down the size of your terrain, you could do that as well. And you can do it on the X or the Y axis. And then if you wanted to as well, if you have two terrain actors like we do now, you can then come in and merge the two terrains together. So you notice this is where we just split it along the X axis. We can control left click, and then you can merge the terrains back together. And now you'll notice we have only one terrain actor in the world. The next tool we're going to talk about is the visibility tool. If you come over here to our terrain and control and left click, you'll notice it's going to start hiding patches of the terrain. And if you control right click, it'll add those patches back. This is very useful, especially if you had, like in these mountains, if we take down our radius and our fall off, say you wanted to have like a cave or something on the side of this mountain. We'll come in here and control left click, and it'll actually hide the patches. And by doing so, it actually removes the collision on the terrain and the visibility. So if you did want to make a cave in here where it actually goes into the terrain, you could do that using this tool. This tool is also very useful for optimizing your terrain based on how large it is. If the player is way over here on the ground and he never sees past these mountains, you can come over here with the visibility tool. You can increase the radius a little bit, and you can actually start just hiding the patches that the player will never see. This will definitely increase performance a lot because you're not actually rendering any of these patches, and it also saves light map memory as well. So it's a good process to remember to do. Now I would say it's only really worth doing on large areas like this corner here. I wouldn't say go in and do it on every single little thing that's actually, like if you have a tiny little building here, it's not really going to do much to save performance wise if you just take out the patches under that little building. But if you did have a massive like Evil Genius base or something like that in here, and there was a basement to that, you would definitely want to remove those sectors so you could go down into the terrain. So it's a very useful tool. The last tool we're going to focus on now is the orientation flip button. And what this will do, we'll bring down the radius a little bit, turn off the fall off. If we go into wireframe mode, you'll notice that our terrain is made up of a bunch of triangles within our patches. So what the orientation flip button does is if you hold down control and left click, it's going to start flipping your triangles the other direction. This can be useful when you're actually sculpting terrain and your terrain isn't doing exactly what you want, and you can flip the triangles to see if you can get better results. So that about sums up the tools here that we're going to talk about for right now. These other tools that are in here we'll cover a little bit later. They have to do with texture panning, rotation, and scale, which we'll get to when we get to the material part of this DVD. So now I'm going to bring our terrain edit window over here, and I'm going to explain to you a little bit about what these settings are over here. So under View Settings, you'll notice that we have Terrain and Terrain 1. This is a pull down. If you have multiple terrain actors in your level, you can choose which one you want to edit. And we go down here under Properties, this will bring up the Properties dialog box. It's the same thing as pressing F4 on your terrain. And the View button right here will actually hide your terrain and unhide your terrain if you didn't want your terrain visible at any time. Now we'll move on to the next setting, which is the Lock button. If at any time you want to lock your terrain so you cannot sculpt or edit your terrain in any way, you want to turn this button on. Just remember that if you find yourself not able to sculpt in your terrain, double check that you have this button turned off. And the next option is Toggle Wireframe On and Off. This is very useful if you want to actually see your wireframe while in lit or unlit mode. And then right under there is our wireframe color, and you can actually choose what color your wireframe is going to be. And we'll come down here under Tessellation, and you can increase and decrease the density of patches within your terrain. I would definitely say be careful with this. You don't want to increase it too much, or if we increase it, go ahead and press yes, you'll notice that we have a much more dense terrain, and this can become very expensive, so we want to keep it pretty low. And the good thing about this is it actually will keep your information that you've already sculpted, so you won't lose any data. And if you find that your terrain is bogging down your frame rate, it might be a good idea to start decreasing the tessellation for better performance. And down here in our terrain edit window is the layers palette, and this is where all your data for your height map, which is based on the terrain sculpting that you've done, and the different materials, deco layers, and foliage layers we will add later. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off our wireframe. I'm going to move our terrain edit window out of the way. I'll scroll way out. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to clear all of our information that we've done right now. So I'm going to grab the Flatten tool, bring the strength and radius all the way up, and I'm going to hold down Control and left click and just start flattening all of our terrain out so we can start with a fresh slate. So now we're going to use the tools and properties that I've already covered to start creating our scene. So I know I want our scene to be a desert environment. So in the background I want to have some mountains and hills covered with sand, and then in the player space I want to have a dried up riverbed that the player can run down. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to come over here to the edge of our terrain. I'm going to grab our paint tool. I'm going to bring down the strength a little bit and the radius and the fall off a bit as well. I'm just going to start sculpting in some mountains here. Might want to bring up our strength a little bit. Maybe our radius as well. It's always good to go back and forth as well. You don't want to keep the same radius and fall off, because if you change it up a bit, you'll get a little bit variation, which starts to look pretty nice. So I'm going to come in here and start making some mountains. It's good to do broad strokes first as well, and then you can do the little details later on, just to get the right silhouette and composition that you want. And you'll notice too that the main tool that I'm going to be using is just the paint tool. You can get a lot of variety just out of the paint brush and using it to sink in areas and raise areas as well. It's important to note as well that terrain is basically based on a height map, and a height map is just a black and white image, kind of like this one right here. So when you're actually painting a map that's a black and white image, and it's taking that and applying that to the vertices of your terrain. That's why right here you'll notice that we have height map selected, and that's technically what you're painting on the terrain. So we'll go over here to where the player is. I'm going to start making a trench. I'm going to hold down Control and right click. start making that trench, just start blocking it out, the path that I want it to be. And come in here and grab the smooth tool, start smoothing this out a little bit as well. Bring down the strength. Go back over to our mountains, start smoothing those out as well. And I'll grab the noise brush, just give a little bit more variation, bring down the strength, just to give a little bit of detail to our mountains. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up our sculpting, and the next thing we'll move on to is terrain materials and texture. I went ahead and finished sculpting our terrain, and I also removed our main material that was on our terrain just so we can start fresh. I also made our light a little bit brighter just so we can start seeing the textures when we start adding them. The first thing we want to do is add a main material to our terrain. This material is going to encompass our entire terrain actor. So let's go ahead and open up the terrain editing mode, and we'll come down here under our layer palette here. So to add our first material, what we're going to do is come up to our content browser and browse to the material that we want to encompass our entire terrain, which in this case is our sand. So I'm going to select our material and right click in this gray area and choose New Terrain Setup Layer from Material, Auto Create. And what this will do is it'll add our sand material, terrain layer setup, to our terrain. So if we go into lit mode here, you'll notice that it added this texture to our terrain. Now what this actually did when we auto created the material was it did a whole hierarchy system from our material all the way to our terrain layer setup. So if we go to our content browser and go to the package that's the same as our map package, which is 3DM Terrain Setup 01, you'll notice that Unreal created two separate things for our terrain. So first it created our terrain material, or if you double click on that, you'll notice that it added our sand material to a terrain material. And then it also added a terrain layer setup where our terrain material is applied. So it's this hierarchy, and if we go back to our terrain here, you'll notice that if you click this gray arrow here, it's going to make a drop down, and here is our terrain material and our terrain layer setup. And so if you look over here, you'll see that there are two buttons here, where if you click this button that's linked to our terrain material, you get all the options of your terrain material, which is the same as going into our content browser and double clicking our terrain material. So Unreal was smart enough to actually add all of this for us with just creating auto create, which is very handy. So let's talk a little bit about our terrain materials. So if we drop down and go to our terrain material properties, you'll see a bunch of options under material. And these are your basic pan, rotation, scale for your material that is applied to the terrain. So if you notice, if we come into scale and change the scale down to like 2, the terrain material will update in real time. Now we're going to set this to about 6, which will eliminate some tiling in the actual terrain material. Now you can play with the rotation as well to actually rotate your texture a little bit, just so it's not straight down the terrain. If you wanted to move your terrain material down a little bit, you could edit the pan, U, and V. Now the nice thing about these controls is that they will update in real time, which means you don't actually have to recache your materials. What I mean by recaching your materials is you'll notice this red button over here that's called Recache Terrain Materials. And it's really important to remember that if you edit any one of your materials from your content browser, that it will not update in real time. So every time you edit your material, you're going to need to come in here and recache your terrain materials. Luckily, when actually editing your material properties, you won't have to do that. Now there are a few tools up here under the tool palette, like texture pan, rotate, and texture scale, that you can actually also use to edit your terrain materials. The problem with these tools is that you won't see the result in real time. Every time you edit using these tools, you'll have to recache your terrain materials. So in my opinion, it's actually better to come into our terrain material properties and edit the values here. So now we're going to go ahead and add another material to our terrain. So if we go to Content Browser, grab another material, and right click and do the same thing that we did before, Auto Create, it should create another terrain layer setup underneath your original material. And you'll notice that the terrain didn't change at all. That's because the first material we add is basically the base terrain material that's applied to our terrain. So if we wanted to make this the base material, we have to select the new terrain material, and there are these arrow keys right here, and this will actually move our sand rock material up above our original material. And you'll notice nothing changed. That's because we have to recache our terrain shaders. And now you'll notice that our sand rocks is now the base terrain material. So go ahead and move this back down and recache again so we get it back to normal. And now I'm going to show you how to paint the sand rocks material onto our terrain. I'm going to move this over a little bit. And I'm going to bring down our radius of our brush a little bit and our fall off. And we're going to select the paint tool. And the paint tool and all the other tools work the same with terrain materials that they do with the height map when we're sculpting our terrain. So we want to have our sand rocks material selected and control left click on the terrain anywhere, and it'll start painting that terrain material. Now you'll notice it'll be laggy for the first second or two, but then after that it should run just fine. So now we can come in here and just start painting along our terrain a different material. And so what essentially is happening is it's layering the sand rocks material over top of our sand material. So if we control right click, you'll notice that it'll erase our second material and start revealing our original material. So now I'm going to go into our terrain material properties for this material. I'm going to bring up the scale a little bit to about 6. And that should be good. And over here, if you wanted to, there's a hide and unhide button where you can actually hide this layer if you just want to see the layer above that. So now we're going to go ahead and add another terrain material to our terrain. So I'm going to go back to the content browser. I'm going to grab this mud cracked material, right click, new terrain layer from material, auto create, and you'll notice now we have 3 terrain materials applied to our terrain. So now what we can do is I'll paint a little bit of the sand rocks material down in here, and if I grab the mud cracked material and I paint it along here, along the bank of the riverbed, you'll notice that this material is now being painted over top of our sand rocks material. So it's really just a layering system. So if I erase the mud cracked material, you'll notice that it brings back the sand rocks. And then if I come to the sand rocks and erase that, you'll notice that the sand is being shown. So you can use this to start layering your terrain materials how you want it and get a nice blend between some of the materials. You can even start experimenting with some of the materials and the different paintbrushes available to you. So if I come over here and I grab like the noise brush, for instance, and have our mud cracked material selected, if I control left click, you'll notice you'll get some spotty results with the noise brush. The same thing with the smooth as well. You can get some pretty interesting results. If I bring my strength up a little bit. So this could be useful for you in some situations. The next thing I want to talk about is specular on terrain materials. By default, specular is turned off to help performance. But if we go into the properties of our terrain and you go to lighting and click on enable specular, you'll notice that specular is now enabled on every material on our terrain. Now you do want to be careful with this because it will impact performance quite a bit, and it will only enable specular for materials that actually have specular turned on in their material. As you can see though, it gives a nice result, and if we bake lights right now, it would be even more apparent. There is one other thing I want to talk about, and that's the complexity of your materials that you add to your terrain. If we go to the content browser, go to our material, and I'll open up our mud cracked material, you can see that it's a fairly simple material with only a few instructions. It's very important that you keep your terrain materials simple, because if you have too many instructions, you will get an error on your terrain. It'll be like a rainbow colored texture, which means that your materials are too complex and you're going to have to optimize them. It is pretty great that Unreal actually warns you that your materials are overcomplicated so your Xbox doesn't explode when you try to play the game. That being said, even if you do have some simple materials, you really only want to have about 5 or 6 materials applied to a terrain at a time. If you go any more than that, you could impact performance as well. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to start actually painting our terrain for our scene. So I'm going to grab the sand rocks material, I'll bring the fall off down a little bit. Make sure you have paint selected. I'm going to start just painting along the path here. It's coming on a little harsh, so we can bring down the strength quite a bit, to about like 14 or so. And then you can start getting some smooth gradient fall off. Bring it down even more. So you can kind of get this blending. If you keep clicking, it'll start blending together with the sand. I'm going to take our mud cracked material and bring the fall off down on this guy. I'm going to start painting along the riverbed. So I'm going to go ahead and continue doing this, and the next thing we'll talk about are deco layers. So you can see I went ahead and finished up painting the materials onto our terrain. If I come over here to the terrain editing mode, you'll notice that I've also added a few more terrain layer setups. So I added some grass patches and some dark mud to our terrain, just to get a little bit more variation. So now we're going to talk about adding deco layers to your scene. Deco layers are great for painting on meshes to your terrain. Things like rocks or trees or even large bushes would be a good candidate for deco layers. The good thing about deco layers is that they do have collision and they also receive lighting and are scattered around using the grid based on our terrain. So if we come up here to our terrain editing mode and scroll down, there's a few ways you can actually add deco layers to our layers. You can either right click in the gray area and go to New Deco Layer, or you can press this button right here, New Deco Layer. And you'll notice it added a blank slated layer to our scene. Now this is basically a container for our deco layer. So it's a little tricky to actually get deco layers to get set up, but if you go to your properties of your terrain, you notice under deco layers, it added a decoration layer. So we can go in here and notice that there isn't a decoration added to the deco layer. So what we want to do is we want to add a new item, and you can see it added a factory, and the factory is set to none. So we want to come over here, create a new object, and click Static Mesh Component Factory. And now we should have the ability to plug in a static mesh to our decorations. So I'll pull this over, and we'll go to our content browser, and I'll grab our cactus here. Close the content browser, and we'll go ahead and add the cactus to our static mesh slot here. We can go ahead and close the factory. And now you'll notice we have a few different parameters here to play with. The density is set to 0.01 by default. You're definitely going to want to bump that up to actually see any results. And the min and max scale is set to 1 by default, which is fine for now. So we'll go ahead and close the terrain properties. And you'll notice we can now expand our deco layers, and there is our static mesh plugged in. So we can right click up here and go to rename, and we can name this cactus deco layer. Press OK, and then that'll be named correctly. And now what we can do is we can take a pretty large brush, and we can come in here and start painting in our cactus on our terrain. So you can see where it would be pretty useful. Now one thing to note, that if we turn wireframe on, you'll notice that each deco layer is actually, the pivot of it is actually snapping to verts on the terrain. So sometimes it's a little bit hard to get a very organic placement of your deco layers, which in case you would probably want to just place static meshes instead. But deco layers can be very useful. Now if you wanted to add a second cactus to our deco layer, we'll go under Properties, and we'll go back under Deco Layers here, and go to Decorations and add a new item again. And do the same thing that we did before, Static Mesh Component, expand that down, and then we'll come in here and find a different cactus, and plug that guy in. Then we can set the density to around 1 or so, or 0.5. And you'll notice that that second decoration that we added is now snapping exactly where our original cactus is. That can be easily offset by coming in here and setting the random seed to 1. And that'll just give it a seed value and place the decoration in different places than our first decoration. Now you can also play with the min and max scale for our cactus. So you can see that our cactus that we laid down, it's all the same size. So we can give a little bit more variation for that. So if we give the min scale like 0.8 and the max scale like 1.2, it's going to start to randomize our cactus. Now the slope rotation blend is if I come in here and I paint our cactus on a slope here, you'll notice that it's sticking straight up. So if I come in here and start giving it a lower value of like 0.02, it'll start going in the slope direction that the terrain is facing. So that can be pretty useful as well. So you could also, instead of having 2 decorations in one deco layer, you could also come over here to in our terrain edit window, and you can add multiple deco layers if you wanted to. So for right now, I'm going to actually go ahead and right click and delete our deco layers we set up. And now I'm going to show you how to set up foliage on terrain. Now foliage layers are bound to specific materials you have on your terrain. I would use foliage for smaller objects such as grass or small plants. They don't have collision and unfortunately do not cast shadows, but they do fade out over a set distance to save on performance, which is a huge benefit over using deco layers. So if I went in here to our grass patches material, which you can see right in here, if I drop down and go to our grass patches material and left click on this button right here, it'll bring up the properties for the grass patches. And you'll notice under foliage there's a place that's called foliage meshes. So what we can do is we can click over here and add new item, and it brings down similar looking properties to our deco layers. So we'll go ahead and close this for now. The first thing we want to do is plug in a static mesh for our foliage. So we'll go to our generic browser and we'll scroll down and grab this plant 01. It's kind of like a little grass bush type thing, and we'll add that to our static mesh category. You'll notice nothing actually happened. That's because our density and some of these other settings aren't set yet. So we can go into density here and we'll set it to something like 3, and you'll also notice that they're really tiny and only appear really close to the camera. There's a few values we need to tweak to look a little better. Those values are the max draw radius, the min transition radius, and the min thinning radius. The max draw radius is basically how far away from the camera you will actually see the mesh. So we want to go ahead and crank this way up to about 8,000 or so. And it's really going to depend on your level that you're creating. So you'll notice that we're able to see the grass mesh much farther from the camera. The next one is min transition radius, and what this will do is it'll state how far away the foliage meshes will stop fading in. So we can set this to around 6,000. I like it to keep it pretty close to the max draw radius, but not equal to. So if you bring the camera back, you'll notice that they're starting to thin out farther away from the camera. And then we'll go to the min thinning radius. This is basically how far away the foliage meshes will get less dense. So we can set this to around 6,000. And then you'll notice that the meshes get a lot more dense closer to the camera. So we're now starting to see closer to what we want. Now we can come into the min scale and max scale and give some variation to our bushes. I'm going to leave the min scale at 1, and I'm going to change the max scale to around 2.3 or so. This gives quite a bit of variation and makes it look a little bit more organic. You can then go over here to your seed and adjust the seed value to give a little bit more randomization to your plants. It'll just randomize the placement. Then we'll come down here to sway scale, and what this will do is it'll control how strong the wind will affect the meshes if you have a wind actor placed in your world. So if I come up here to our content browser and go to actor classes, info, and then wind directional source, you can right click and add wind directional source to our level. And you can see that it's already starting to affect our meshes. So we turn on our real-time preview here, you can see that our meshes are slightly swaying in the wind. And what this sway scale will do is it's basically a multiplier for your wind. So we set this to 1.4, you'll notice that our meshes are moving a little bit faster in our scene. Then we'll go down to our alpha map threshold, and what this will do is it'll control how much your meshes appear near the border of the painted area. So if we set this to 1, you'll notice that our meshes are clumping closer together within the material that's painted. So we'll set this back down to 0. And then our next thing is slope rotation blend. And this acts just like what it does with the deco layers. So if we set this to something like 1, you'll notice that our foliage meshes are now sloping with the terrain. So we'll set this to about 0.8 or so, just to get a little bit of slope rotation. That just about sums it up for our foliage layer properties. So we'll go ahead and close this out. And we'll bring up our terrain edit dialog box again and select our material. And you'll notice that if we come in here and control and left click, wherever we paint the material, the grass foliage layers are going to show up. And if you control right click, you can paint away as well. This gives you quite a bit of control over where your foliage meshes are actually going to show up. Just keep in mind that you are also erasing the material and not just the foliage meshes. If you don't want your foliage meshes to be bound by a material, you can't do that through the terrain system. But what you can do is you can add a foliage factory volume to your scene to get foliage wherever you want inside a volume. So I'm going to go ahead and unhide my builder brush and select it, and I'll come over here to volumes, left click, and add foliage factory. And you'll notice this added a foliage factory volume where my builder brush was. So if we press F4 and bring up the foliage factory properties, you'll notice that under foliage we have meshes, and if we add a new item, we can come in here to instant static mesh, come to our content browser, grab our bush, and go ahead and apply that, and it'll actually apply the static mesh inside the volume. So this gives you a little bit of control over where your foliage meshes are going to apply. And the great thing about this is you can control whether or not the instances of the foliage meshes will appear on BSP, static meshes, and terrain. And it has the same properties that it did for the foliage for the terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and close this out, and we'll go ahead and delete the foliage factory. So that pretty much wraps up everything there is to know about terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and add a few more deco layers and a few static meshes to the scene to finish it up. So here's the finished scene created with all the tools and features of terrain covered in this video. All the content you see is included with the video, so you should definitely check it out. One thing I almost forgot to mention is, in my opinion, one of terrain's best features, and that is collision. Although more expensive, terrain's collision is way more fluid and smooth than any static mesh collision. So the best way to test this is just to drive around your level. So we can go over here to a corner of our map, and we'll go up here to our content browser, actor classes, navigation point, UDK vehicle factory, UT vehicle factory, and then choose the Scorpion. And we can go ahead and right click, add Scorpion here, and you'll notice that Scorpion has been added to our level. Go ahead and close our actor classes, and now go to anywhere in the world and click play from here. Now we can just run over to our vehicle, jump in, and start driving around. This concludes our lesson on creating terrain in the UDK editor. I hope you enjoyed this video. Be sure to check out our other videos, and thanks for watching 3dmotive.com.